Okay, so we're now live at the fourth and last day of the 14th edition of the Meeting of Studies on the Origins of Contemporary Philosophy. Today, with a talk by Professor Mark Textor from King's College London. Professor Textor, thank you for being here. You may please begin.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and good morning to the people in Brazil. I'm very sorry that I can't be there. And I will talk today about two concepts in early analytic philosophy. So here's the plan of what I want to do. So my general question is, how did the concept of a concept change in the development of early, very analytic philosophy? How do we get roughly where we are at the moment? Where did we start from? What were the main changes? Were the changes for the better or for the worse? And I will start by looking at Bernard Bolzano, as I said, a very early analytic philosopher, who was very closely engaged with Kant, but makes substantial changes to the Kantian framework. I will look at what he says about concepts. And then I think there's really a new beginning in the theory of concepts with Frege. So Gottlob Frege, shortly, he was born in the year Bolzano died. So Bolzano was born in 1781, the year of the first edition of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and he's very much engaged with Kant, and he died in 1848. Frege was born in 1848, and he doesn't engage very much with Bolzano, also there are similarities. And I think of him as really starting over in the theory of concepts and giving us a kind of, when I gave this talk before, as a kind of completely new idea. We think of concepts by theorizing what is to be incomplete. But then someone in the audience stood up and said, no, that's wrong. You can find all this already in the Stoics. And as some of you will know, there's a paper which says Frege plagiarized the Stoics. I don't know about that, but it's true that there are very similar ideas in the Stoics as in Frege, and they have to do with incompleteness. The Stoics talked about expressions to be elliptic, ellipé. I won't go into that. So maybe Frege just returns after a long time to Stoic insights. But I will look at this very closely, and I will look at the challenges we face when we have this new outlook on concepts, which is tied to the notion of incompleteness. And I think I can tackle some of these challenges. I will try to do so. But in the end, it will turn out that I just formulate them in such a way that we just reformulate them in such a way that even if we tackle them, there's a new challenge arising, and that's connected to Wittgenstein and Ramsey, who in a way respond to Frege. And I will not try to refute Wittgenstein, so I leave that for other people. But I will link this then to Wittgenstein. Okay, so here we go. Bernard Bolzano. Well, as I said before, Bolzano engages very closely with Kant. And in Kant, you find concept as opposed to intuition. There's a famous passage in the Critique of Pure Reason where he gives you the kind of kinds of representation. So there's representation. And in the kind of representation, you find a subkind, which is called cognition. And don't be fooled. So in German, Erkenntnis has now a ring of, it has to do with knowledge. Erkenntnis is something where someone comes to know something. It's an acquisition of knowledge. That's not the meaning of Erkenntnis in the Kantian jargon. erkenntnis is just a general form of representation. Representation is consciousness. Yeah. But these are representations, and representations are here mental goings on, something people do. They come into varieties. There's intuitions and concepts. Yeah. So intuition and concept are kinds of representations. And they're distinguished by, I simply read what Kant says, the intuition relates to the object immediately and is singular, and the concept only immediately by means of a mark which several things may have in common. So you get a distinction of representations into cognitions into intuitions and concepts. And intuitions have only one object, and they don't represent it by means of marks. They represent it immediately. And the others, I mean, it's left open whether they have one or several objects, but they latch onto whatever they latch on the concepts by means of marks. Okay, that sets the stage for Bolzano. So here's Bolzano, 1781 to 1848. Bolzano, I mean, there's a book by one of Bolzano's students, which is ascribed to Bolzano, Prionsky, which is called The New Anti-Kant. But Bolzano, that's a bit of an overstatement. Bolzano is not a Kant hater, a Kant basher. He thinks there's some things absolutely right in Kant, but Kant has not formulated them well. We need to improve on Kant's explanations and the theory which is presupposed, in which these insights are embedded. So Bolzano starts out from the notion of, in German, Satz an sich, sentence in itself. And that's the thing which moves the whole idea and which sets him. I mean, Bolzano is, for instance, not a neo-Kantian in an important sense, because he has this notion of a Satz an sich which has no kind of reflection in Kant and neo-Kantian work, but which is very similar to the Fregean notion of a thought. So he introduces, he thinks that the notion of a Satz an sich, or I will simply talk about proposition, is primitive. You cannot define it, but you can make people latch onto it and understand it by thinking about something like becoming more and more general. So you start out from, I mean, there are written sentences. Yeah, here on the paper you have a couple of written sentences. There are spoken sentences. And there maybe there are thought sentences. And then Bolzano would say, well, there are also just sentences. Yeah, just sentences. Sentences, these sentences he calls sentences in themselves. They're neither written, they're neither spoken, they're neither thought, they're just sentences. What are these sentences? Well, they're not on paper, they're not in a mind, they're not somehow materialized. They're abstract objects. They're things which are either true or false, but they're not anywhere, or they're not at some time. So they are very close to what Frege thought are thoughts. An important thing which distinguishes Bolzano from Frege is that he thinks that all sentences have the same form, A has B. And another thing which brings him again close to Frege is that he thinks that sentences in themselves are put together out of constituents. And that allows him now to introduce the idea of an objective idea, Vorstellung an sich, where we start with sentences in themselves or propositions, and an idea is just a part of a proposition, which is itself not a proposition. Okay, so sentences in themselves, ideas, objective ideas, and now we get to intuition and concepts in the next step. Yeah. So in the realm of, while Kant found the distinction between intuition and concept in the realm of representations, mental, intentional episodes in thinkers. Bolzano finds an analog to that in the realm of propositions. Yeah? So there are objective intuitions and objective concepts. And an objective intuition is an idea in itself, a Vorstellung an sich, which is simple and singular. Yeah? So that corresponds exactly to Kant's characterization of intuition. It's of one thing, and it doesn't represent this by means of marks, but it's immediate. Yeah, that corresponds in Bolzano to the simplicity of the intuition. So an objective intuition is a simple and singular objective idea. What about concept? Well, that's now easy. A concept is an objective idea that neither is nor contains an objective intuition. So objective intuition is here the basic concept which allows you to introduce the concept of an objective concept. And then you can define what is a conceptual proposition. Yeah, that's a proposition, a Satz in itself, which only contains concepts. Example he uses quite often, that God is omnipresent, or on most intuitive understandings, propositions of arithmetic. And an intuitive proposition, which he also calls empirical proposition, is one in which you have at least one objective intuition. Yeah. Examples are something like that Socrates was Athenian. The idea is here that created contingent beings can only be represented by means of representations, Vorstellung an sich, which contain at least one intuition. You know, you have always something like the thing which happened at this time, where this is the linguistic expression of an intuition. Things are a bit more complicated, but that's the rough idea. Yeah, so what we have now is a reconstruction of the Kantian distinction between intuition and concept in a framework which you think is very close to the original ideas of people like Russell Moore and Frege, where we have propositions as mind-independent abstract objects which are either true or false. And in that we inject the notion of an intuition and concept, and get a further distinction between conceptual propositions and intuitive propositions, which you don't find, for instance, in Frege. Yeah? It doesn't make anything of that. We'll later see maybe why. Okay, why care? I mean, why would you want to have such a distinction? Why would that be of any interest? What is the scientific significance for this? And Bolzano will tell you it's of extreme, extreme, it's of great scientific importance. I'll simply read to you what he says, and then we look at that a bit more closely. He says, if one puts forth truths in a scientific treatise, truths that are composed out of concepts and truths which contain intuitions have to be treated completely differently, especially if one does not only ask for the truth to be made certain, but for the specification of its objective grounds. We can find the ground of a pure conceptual truth always only in other conceptual truths. The ground of an intuitive truth can at least in part lie in the objects represented by the contained intuitions. So there is an important difference between conceptual and intuitive truths when it comes to organizing them in a science. Yeah? The scientific treatise mirrors how a science is organized. And this difference relates to how they are. What are the grounds of these truths? Yeah. What are grounds? I mean, if you think about say the beautiful dilemma, yeah, then you get a sense of grounds. So think, why is something good? Is it good because the gods like it, or do the gods like it because it's good? Yeah. What you talk about here is it might be everything which is good is liked by the gods, and the god like everything which is good. But there's an asymmetry when you ask yourself, why is that the case? What makes this the case? Are things good in virtue of being liked by God, or does God like them in virtue of them being good? So there's an asymmetry which we often mark by words like because or in virtue. And with that comes the idea that also some truths may be logically equivalent. One of them might be more fundamental and be the ground for the other. Yeah, it's. I hope it's the case that God loves whatever certain deeds because they're good, and so that is the goodness is the more fundamental thing, and that's reflected in lots of our intuitions and lots of our theorizing. And Bolzano was one of the first who made that more precise. So, what are the grounds and consequences? He says that the more fundamental thing here, that these things are good, is the ground. What are really grounds? Grounds are truths, and truths are true propositions. So true propositions stand in the ground and consequence relation. That's why the last sentence here, that the ground lies in part in the object, is not quite right. But the idea is that there is a hierarchy of truths which is organized in such a way that we go from consequences to the grounds. And if we try to impose such an hierarchy on the truths we have of whose truths we have already been convinced, yeah, if we try to find out which is the ground and which is the consequence, then the intuitive and the conceptual truths need to be organized differently. We have some knowledge about how these are organized. Yeah, so we know that if we have a conceptual truth, then its grounds will be other conceptual truths. You might think there's a kind of maximal ground which contains all its grounds. So we know that a conceptual truth has as its maximal ground always another, maybe very complex conceptual truth. Or you might think of it as a kind of tree which goes from the top to the bottom. Then you know if you have a conceptual truth, you will find in that tree only other conceptual truths. There's an argument for that, which I haven't put in here because my focus is more the notion of a concept. But we can talk about this in the Q&A or in the commentary section. But when it comes to intuitive truths, you know that the grounds will contain at least some intuitive truths, and the tree will never end. Yeah, it will go on and on and on, and it doesn't bottom out anywhere. Again, there's an argument for that, and we can talk about this. But you can see that if you want to organize things in terms of ground consequence relations, these things have to be treated very differently. And you can see an immediate upshot of that. Yeah, if you have say an arithmetical truth, you have assured yourself that it contains only concepts, then you know there must be a proof of it, something which is inferring it from grounds, such that the grounds are only conceptual propositions, conceptual truths. Go back to Kant on the first pages of the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant says 5 + 7 = 12. That's something where you only can come to know it by means of an exercise of intuition or imagination. If 5 + 7 = 12 is just a conceptual truth, if you can't find any simple and singular presentations in this proposition, Bolzano will say, no, that's wrong. I mean, you might just come to know it, by means of exercise, whatever, looking at your hand, looking at this hand, adding two thumbs to it or something like that. But that's neither here nor there. I mean, that's about epistemology. When we ask ourselves, why is it the case? What is the thing which grounds it? Then we know by a priori reasoning, there must be a ground of it, if it has a ground at all. It's not saying that every conceptual truth has a ground, but if it has a ground at all, then there is a ground which is a conceptual proposition. And what we do in mathematics, or if we try to work this idea at all, is we try to find the grounds of the truths we already know. And in this case, it will mean we are assured that there is a grounding tree which we try to recapture and improve, which contains only conceptual propositions. And you can see people like Frege actually following that. They try to say, I mean, we know that 5 + 7 = 12, but what we want to know is we want to know what makes that the case. Is there something more we can say? Can we find the grounds of this? And if Frege had read more Bolzano, you could have appealed to Bolzano and said, we know there must be a proof which captures the true grounding tree, which contains only conceptual propositions. Okay, so that's an interesting application of the idea of conceptual and intuitive propositions. This idea completely disappears after Bolzano. I think there's really no one who, in the further development of what then became analytic philosophy, paid great attention to it. And certainly not. Also, there are, as I said, similarities between Frege and Bolzano. And Frege had been repeatedly pointed to Bolzano. He seems never have taken that seriously. That the idea to distinguish between concepts and intuitions in the realm of, say, thoughts and truth value bearers completely disappears. It's no longer discussed. And even Bolzano is no longer discussed until people in, say, the Vienna Circle try to promote it again and rediscover it. We get some, I think, okay, it may be that Frege got this idea from the Stoics, I don't know. But there's a completely new idea on the scene. So the idea, so in Bolzano, concept has to be understood as that which is not an intuition, that which is neither an intuition nor contains one. That becomes completely unimportant for the next, I don't know how many slides I have here, 10 slides here. What becomes of immense importance is the distinction between complete and incomplete thingies. And I will now take you through the basics of this distinction and how this distinction is worked in important parts of 19th century German philosophy of logic and language, and see where we get to when we do this. So I think Frege has a very nice and concise passage in which he puts this all together in a very concise and compact form. I'll simply read it to you and unpack it then a bit. Yeah. So he says the simplest case in which a thought is very much like a Boltzanian sentence in itself. Yeah, it's an abstract object which is either true or false. Is constructed out of parts. Yeah, again, like Bolzano, thoughts have parts. Constructed out of parts is that of a thought which consists of a complete part and an unsaturated one. So sometimes we get instead of incomplete, unsaturated, but it's the same thing, just a different word. The latter we may also call the predicative part. Each of these parts must equally have a reference. If the whole sentence is to have a referent, a truth value, we call the reference of the complete part an object, that of the part which is in need of supplementation, which is unsaturated or predicative, we call concept. Yeah? So here you get now a distinction between object and concept. And objects are the things for which complete expressions stand, and concepts are the things for which incomplete expressions stand. Oh, a bit more. Here's a wonderful schema. Maybe not wonderful, but here's a schema which might be helpful. If not, unfortunately, the formatting has been again knocked a bit out of place, but let's see whether we can get through it. So we have the level of the sign, which is here in this case the sentence Caesar conquered Gaul, and we find on that level a distinction between complete and incomplete sentence parts. And you have really to think of the incomplete sentence part, conquered Gaul, as somehow a fragment, as something which has a gap. Frege literally speaks of gaps. Yeah, look, it has a gap in which something else is inserted. Yeah, you think of the sentence Caesar conquered Gaul as something which where you might start out with the fragment conquered Gaul and complete it. That's what Frege wants you to do. Then Caesar conquered Gaul has a sense. Yeah, it expresses what Frege calls a thought, and this thought has, as a Boltzanian proposition, it has parts. Well, and some of these parts are incomplete. And these incomplete parts, these incomplete sentences are expressed here by the words conquered Gaul. And again, they're complete sentences and they come together and construct out of them a thought. Now it gets more interesting. These sentences are the sense which is expressed by Caesar is a mode of presentation of something, and Frege thinks the sense of that mode of presentation is complete. It represents an object, and in this sense, what is represented is, I guess, the man Caesar. When it comes, yeah, all my little arrows have somehow switched over here. So it should go from sense to concept. The incomplete sense is a mode of presentation of an incomplete object. Frege calls this incomplete object concept. And so please don't think when we talk about Fregean concepts, these are things on the level of reference. Yeah, they're not objective ideas or senses, but they are the level of reference. What's a special thing about them is they are also incomplete. You can they take an object and they return for this object a truth value. So either the true or the false. And because of that, a concept somehow determines, in addition, a value range, which is, think of all the ordered pairs. Yeah, Textor, and I go into the concept conquered Gaul, false. Übel, connected to the concept conquered Gaul, also false. Caesar, connected to the concept conquered Gaul, true. Yeah, so So we have a range of ordered pairs. The first one is an object, the second one a truth value. And that range, that set of ordered pairs is determined by a concept and can sometimes be used by Frege as a kind of stand-in for the concept. Okay, so I don't know if any one of you understands what incompleteness is. It's not something where you think, I always knew what incompleteness is, or it's something we can easily make sense of. When you look at Frege's early work, he uses a phrase which you can also find in the polymath Wilhelm Wundt. So Wundt was not only the founder of empirical psychology, or maybe he's not the founder of empirical psychology, he's the person who got the subject empirical psychology to be acknowledged, so to say, by institutions. But he also wrote ethics, and he wrote a logic book which was influential and read by Frege. And Wundt describes what is going on in these cases, or characterizes this as that a concept like an atom never occurs in isolation. I find that reasonably helpful. And when you think about chemistry and try to get your chemistry knowledge going by looking at this kind of little diagram on the right, it might help you to think about incompleteness. So let's look at what does it mean that something never occurs in isolation. With respect to atoms, one can say that, I think, quite clearly. So take an atom. An atom is such that, in virtue of the laws of nature, nomologically impossible, that an atom does not bond with other atoms. Whenever you find an atom, by laws of nature, it comes with other guys. It never appears on its own. It always forms molecules. But it's possible that an atom bonds with different molecules. It's not like it's always tied to this atom, that atom, and they form a molecule. It can, it's nomologically possible that it connects with other atoms to molecules, but it never is, so to say, on its own. And it takes a specific, it's also by the laws of nature, it takes a specific number of atoms to form a molecule and not others. I think that's behind this idea of a concept never occurs in isolation. But you cannot formulate it in terms of nomologically necessary or necessary, because concepts are not things which go in and out of existence. They have no temporal properties. So you need to say something like, it is essential for a concept to be combined with an object to a judgeable content. As it is nomologically required by the laws of nature that an atom combines with other atoms to a molecule. So it's essential for a concept to combine with an object to a judgeable content, to something like a state of affairs. And it's also essential for a particular concept that it cannot combine with, say, 7 objects to a judgeable content. It takes a kind of very particular number, namely, I think it is a concept, one object to a judgeable content, but it can combine with distinct objects to judgeable contents. So that's this analogy. I've been going on a bit about this analogy. Why, if one looks at the literature on Frege, people think quite often, there's at least a number of people in the secondary literature who think that because Frege says this never occurs in isolation, which I've explained here for the early Frege, but it so to see, the case for Frege even in his later period. Some concepts are just some kind of abstractions from thoughts or judgeable contents. They are not they're just ways of carving up this thing. They have no identity on their own. They are not intelligible as independent of these concepts, of these contents. And that makes it very, Frege also likes to talk about building blocks, yeah, that modes of presentations, thoughts are built together, constructed out of building blocks. That way of thinking makes that very difficult. But I mean, I found it here really helpful to look at how Wundt works this idea. Because Wundt is, I mean, Frege refers to Wundt in this respect, and Wundt has quite interesting things to say about it. And there's nothing like in Frege where he says, I disagree with Wundt on this. And here's what Wundt says about it. So he says, it's undeniable that logical analysis of judgment must be supported by investigating its conceptual elements. Element will be here a crucial phrase. For the same reason, the grammarian, although the word occurs as little in isolation as the concept does, gives priority to the word formation over the sentence formation, or the chemist, although chemical elements mostly don't occur in isolation, gives priority to the properties of the elements over the properties of the compounds. This order will also be appropriate for the logician. So what he's saying is that, look, I mean, yes, we never find an atom in isolation. We never find a word in isolation. But that doesn't mean that our words are just in the order of explanation of second-rate importance. It's rather the opposite. Yeah, we need to start with words. We need to start with atoms to understand the compounds. Why is that? Well, you will think that the properties of the compounds are, I mean, it might be that epistemologically you only can get at the parts by starting with the compounds. But the atoms, the words, and so on, they have intrinsic properties which determine what kind of compounds they enter, what kind of compounds you can extract, not extract them from, but find in. So they have genuine properties, they have properties independent and prior to the compounds. Just you never can find them, so to say, outside of these compounds. But that doesn't mean that they have not important properties which are prior to the compounds. This idea is around in the German literature on logic for quite a while, and I think Frege clearly knew it. Oh, yeah, here, unfortunately, it has again knocked out the formatting a bit. With many words, in a very, one cannot see it differently, in a very wordy passage. In his first Logic, Lotze formulated that quite well, I thought. So he says, just as it's always logic and chemistry, it's always atoms and concepts, yeah. So just as chemistry only starts to develop when the individual bodily masses are conceived as chemical elements, that is, conceived as having properties and internal determinations that fix in advance the form and proportion of future combinations. Logic can only exist if the simple with whose composition it is almost exclusively concerned is right from the beginning not merely conceived as a psychological product under the name of a presentation or concept in general, but immediately as logical element that is cast in the forms of thought that express themselves verbally in the parts of speech and which assign every element its place and meaning in higher logical, unfortunately I can't read this here, forms, I guess. So again, it's the same idea. So it's the idea that, yes, atoms, words, and concepts are something which doesn't occur in isolation. But atoms, words, and concepts have intrinsic properties and internal determination that fix in advance in which combinations they occur. And because you have this intrinsic determination, there's a kind of priority of the simple before the complex. It's not an epistemological one, but it's a kind of, if you want, metaphysical one. Yeah. That gives rise to the idea of building blocks. I mean, think literally. I don't know if you play that much anymore with Lego. I don't, but I did at some point. Think of a Lego building block. Yeah? If you have these little nooks and crannies in the building block, they determine which kind of buildings you can make out of the building block. You cannot do anything. Not any building will be built out of 7 building blocks which have a certain shape. What corresponds to, I mean, quite literally, these are unsaturated in certain ways. They have gaps. Yeah, they have gaps, and here the gaps are real. You can put something in it, and because you have these gaps, certain further combinations and particular kind of combinations and buildings can be made out of them. And I think that's exactly the idea Wundt, Lotze, and Frege have in mind when they talk about that thoughts are built up from building blocks, that sentences are built up from incomplete parts, and that incompleteness is such that it's a genuine thing. Yeah, it's something which is of importance and which determines further properties. You can get a better sense of incompleteness when it comes to sense when you look at the signs. Here, Frege and Russell see something I think illuminating. So Frege talks here about his concept script, his artificial script to express thoughts, and he says the sign of a property. Well, I don't distinguish between property and concept. You know, concept is something like a property. The sign of a property never occurs without at least indicating a thing to which the property applies. The designation of a relation never without indication of the thing that stands in it. So a sign of a property, say, is round, is not really what, according to Frege, roundness, but it indicates how it would figure in sentences which would ascribe roundness to something. That's even clearer in a text which Russell wrote 40 years later, which I think has a very similar idea, makes a similar point. So Russell says the proper symbol for yellow, assuming for the sake of illustration that this is an attribute, is not the single word yellow, but the propositional function x is yellow, where the structure of the symbol shows the position which the word yellow must have if it is to be significant. So it's the propositional function x is yellow. You can read off from that. It has actual properties. It's actually, and if you want to say that, it's incomplete because there's this indeterminate x in there. It shows how it figures in meaningful sentences. So it's a building block where you can look at it and think, it has some actual properties, actual gaps, which tell me how complex sentences or sentences in which it occurs will look like. Okay, so the idea I want to get across is that for people like before Frege, Lotze, then Wundt, Frege, and so on, it's very important to think of the basic things logic is concerned with. In Frege's case, it's actually thoughts. And then it's kind of, in early Frege's judgeable contents, which are like thoughts, but made out of what he later will call reference. Now, these things have actual properties, non-modal properties, which determine how they will figure in larger wholes. Yeah, there's already something in the sense of is unique of of a concept word which determines how it will figure in thoughts. There's something in what he early calls concept, which figures how it will determine, how it will figure in states of affairs. And what this determining is, this actual property is unsaturatedness. It's a metaphor which tells you something about this property. So there's a property like having a gap which determines how it will figure in these things. And you might think, oh God, I now need to understand what it means for a thought to have a gap, and it's quite difficult. I want at least to point out that this is a really substantial assumption. Yeah? You might think you can do things much easier. The important thing here is that one way of thinking about this is there's an actual property which determines a potential, the combinatorial potential, yeah, of this expression or this thought. And maybe there is nothing like that. You could simply characterize, say, a concept word or a concept sense directly by the way it combines, or not by an actual property, but by a modal property, by saying this is a word which is such that if you add a noun, you get a sentence. And that's, for instance, that's done in what is called categorical grammar. Yeah? Instead of saying there's this mysterious property and it determines the combinatorial potential, you describe the word directly in terms of how it combines with which things to what output, to which results. Namely, it takes you from a noun to a sentence. So we don't look anymore for a non-modal property, but we take it to say directly on the chin and say we just describe it in terms of inputs and outputs. And then you don't need to think about gaps anymore. So it's a really substantial assumption which is made in this literature. Okay, let me talk a bit about the great difficulty of incompleteness. Yeah, so incompleteness, I mean, we get a bit of a purchase on it. We now know a bit about it. And we now know that incompleteness is an actual property of something which determines its combinatorial potential. Now, the problem, the great difficulty arises because Frege thinks that some things, some words and some sentences are complete while others are incomplete. So the word Caesar is complete. The sense Caesar expresses is complete. Therefore, it's a mode of presentation of an object. The sense of conqueror's goal is incomplete. The predicate gap, conquered goal is incomplete. Therefore, its referent is a concept. Where does this asymmetry come from? That's the thing people ask. Because on a very plausible understanding which we have now of never in isolation, you never find something like concept words like is conqueror's goal in isolation. But you also don't find Caesar in isolation. It's not like that. You find that hanging around on its own, or more theoretically understood. I mean, why not think, or you should think of Caesar as having a gap in which a concept word can go, and that takes you to a whole sentence. So if you have any that's nicely now expressed by Richard Gaskin. If there's any decent notion of unsaturatedness in the offing, I've offered you such a notion of unsaturatedness. The context principle is going to assure us that all words are, as far as the saturated unsaturated distinction is concerned, on a par with another. The way I explained it, I don't even need the context principle. Yeah, the context principle says is another thing Frege contributed to the discussion, that words have meaning, words have sense and reference only in the context of a sentence. You don't even need that. You just need to think about if there is something like a property of conquered goal which determines how it figures in sentences, how it combines two sentences. There is something equal to the word Caesar, which determines how it combines two sentences. So they're both incomplete. So you cannot use the incomplete or incomplete, complete, unsaturated, saturated distinction to introduce something like a decent notion of concept, because otherwise everything would be a concept. Or everything would be an object, which means the distinction between object and concept has no interest. So I think actually Frege has an answer to that. The answer can be found in Frege's Foundations of Arithmetic, Grundlagen der Arithmetik. And it has been already in Michael Kramer in his paper on sense and reference, origins of a distinction in the Cambridge Handbook, points us to this. So how do we make progress with this problem? So some people have said we should give up this idea that words have meaning only in the context of a sentence. As Peter Geach has, if you are interested, has disputed that. He said, well, yeah, Caesar has sense and reference outside of a context of a sentence. You find it in isolation. Think of vocative uses of names. Hey, you, get off my cloud. Yeah. Hey, you. That's used outside of a sentence, and so on and so forth. So some people would give that up, the context principle. Frege doesn't do that. And I'm here just concerned with how Frege works this. And he says, only in the context of a sentence, words have a Bedeutung. Yeah? It's difficult to translate because this is early Frege, so I've translated it by using the German word. Hence, all will depend on the explanation of the sense of sentences in which a number word occurs. So he's concerned with number words. This still leaves a very wide choice, but we have already established that number words are understood as standing for self-subsisting objects, which are just objects. Thereby, a kind of sentence is given which needs to have a sense, sentences which express a recognition. So I think his idea is to say, look, the context principle is something I want to uphold. So any word, whether a concept word which is incomplete or an let's say object word, a singular term which is complete, they occur in sentence. But for objects, for complete expressions, which I would call in a very broad sense names, there's a specific kind of sentence which must have a sense and in which these words can occur, which gives you their meaning, and which, because the names can occur only in this kind of sentence, not only because the incomplete expressions cannot occur in this kind of sentence, we get a distinction. Yeah, so we have sentences which express a recognition, something like the evening star is the evening star is the morning star, or 7 plus 5 equals 12. Yeah, these sentences express a recognition. If an expression can occur to the left or the right of the identity sign, then it's a name. And we haven't given up somehow the idea that it is sentences in whose context these words need to have a sense and reference. And now the question is, can incomplete expressions occur in sentences which express a recognition, identity sentences? Answer is no, they can't. Therefore, we get a kind of systematic distinction. And so here, look at these examples. Yeah, okay, this is, if something is complete, a name, an object designator, it can complete ... identity, or ... equals A to the expression of a true-false thought. Incomplete signs cannot complete the identity sign to a true or false, to a sentence which expresses a true or false thought. Therefore, we get a distinction, all with respect to identity sentences. And that's what Frege says. Yeah. So it's here is this paper. What is a function? He says the function signs cannot occur like numerals on the one side of an equation without further supplementation. They can only occur completed by a sign that designates or indicates a number. Here are a couple of examples. Take an incomplete expression, something like conquers goal, or is a chordate thing with a heart, or is a renate, a thing with a kidney. X is a chordate identical to X is a renate, that's ungrammatical. Even if you bind the quantifier, even if you bind the variable, it remains ungrammatical. You get something ungrammatical where you have to the left and to the right of a sign, something like an incomplete expression. When you go to everything is such that if it's a chordate, then it's a renate and the other way around. But there's no reference to concepts. There's no need to think that there are any kind of objects are in the offing. What about sentence like, I mean, that seems to be now obviously false, yeah, because you can say something like the concept chordate is just the concept renate. That might be false, but that's not the point. Yeah, Frege says they need to express a thought which can be either true or false. But as some of you will recall, one of the kind of strange and surprising things of Frege is that he thinks that expressions of the form the concept horse or the concept renate, they don't refer to a concept, they refer to an object. That all makes very much sense if you think that it's really something like definitional, that say something of the kind name, which refers to an object, must, well, if that is tied to the identity sign, yeah. So as soon as you have something which can go to the left or the right of the identity sign and complete that to something which expresses a thought, then you get an object. You can do this with the concept chordate and the concept renate. You will think that's false. Or if you have the intuition that is false, then that refers to an object, because it's more or less a definition of what an object is, which involves the notion of the identity sign. And here we get it, yeah, the relation of equality, by which I understand complete coincidence. Identity can only be thought of holding between objects, not concepts. So in Frege, there's an extremely tight connection between identity and objects. If something can stand in the identity relation, if something can be reported to stand in the identity relation with a meaningful sentence like A is identical to B, then it's an object and not a concept. That leads to kind of really strange consequences for concepts. Yeah? I mean, you cannot, in order to count something, you need to be able to say that this is the same as that, or it's distinct from that. So because if I have this cup, and I say I have one cup, if I want to count, I must be able to say this is one cup, this is another thing. So the notion of identity is involved in counting. So you cannot count concepts. And say whatever is expressed by is a renate. or is a human being and is a rational biped. They're neither identical nor different. Very strange consequences. And that's Frege's idea. Okay, now you can see, I mean, if we have now, so to say, carry the problem around of making sense of completeness and incompleteness, such that it's not everything is complete and not everything is incomplete. And it lines up with the notion of a concept. In the end, it all comes down to the notion of identity. Yeah? Identity and identity sentences are the things which somehow anchor that distinction in Frege. And an assumption, again, I just want to point out as the end and give you kind of outlook which you might then pursue or not pursue. For Frege, it's clear that the identity sign is part of the concept script, part of, so to say, the best language we can have to think and reason in. For Wittgenstein, the identity sign is misleading. He says, in a conceptual notation, it is superfluous. And he says there is no relation of identity. Instead of identity, we would have repetition of name and so on. Identity is, the sign of identity is a misleading expression. That explains to a large part why Wittgenstein thinks that a distinction between concept and object is a kind of artifact of natural language. It's not much it's not something which should be preserved. It's something which should be, when we finally articulate the world most finely in elementary sentences and truth functions, we should be abandoned. And when you look at atomic states of affairs, something which corresponds to Fregean judgeable contents, they're only composed of, are they objects of something which is neither an object nor a concept, of things that hang in each other like links in a chain. For Frege, judgeable contents, thoughts, and so on have always an incomplete part which is completed by either another incomplete part or by something which is complete. Nothing like that is anymore visible in the state of affairs of the dictators. They just have things which hang in each other like links in a chain. There's nothing like a complete or incomplete part. So for people like Wittgenstein and later Ramsey, distinguishing between concepts and objects, that's out of date. There's no reason, no good motivation, and no way to do it. So we should just give that up. And if you're a fan of the distinction between concept and object, you need to engage Wittgenstein's arguments about identity. You need to say, look, no. We actually need an identity sign. Without identity sign, we miss something very important. And then you can backtrack and can reintroduce the notion of a concept which is of any logical interest. Okay, that's what I had to say today.
Thank you, Professor Textor. We'll now have the comments from Professor Ernesto Justi. We're very happy to have you here.
Okay, thank you, Professor Textor, for your presentation. It's an honor and a pleasure to comment on your text. I've read and learned a lot from your books and articles, so my comments will be those of a curious reader. I will not challenge any of the points presented, but rather point to some doubts the text had generated to me. My first remark concerns the centrality given to the Kantian distinction between concepts and intuitions. I believe that in retrospect, we owe to Charles Parsons the standard reading that associates Kantian intuition with immediacy and directness. In his polemic with Hintika concerning Kantian intuition, I think that Hintika's proposal of considering intuitions as the analog of the existential quantifier, although thought-provoking, is anachronistic and at odds with Kant's text, and was superseded by more conservative readings of Kant. However, this may be a case where, looking at the tree, we miss the forest. In fact, Kant's Copernican revolution can be interpreted in different ways, as reversing and putting in doubt many heretic dichotomies of modern philosophy. Looking at Kant's philosophy as a whole, as important as the opposition between concepts and intuition is the opposition between concepts and judgments. As is well known, Kant inverts the order of the classical German logic of the manuals, like of the likes of Georg Meyer and others, and give priority to concepts over judgments. I quote from A130, B170 in the critique. Pure general logic deals with concepts, judgments, and inferences corresponding exactly to the functions and order of those powers of the mind, which are comprehended under the broad designation of understanding in general, end quote. Kant argues then that concepts are prior to judgment. According to Kant, a judgment is a combination of two or more concepts, so concepts must exist before judgments can be formed. This means that a judgment is a way of combining different representations into a single unified thought. But in order to combine representations, we must first have concepts. Kant also argues that concepts are necessary for experience. In order to experience something, we must be able to categorize it and place it in a conceptual framework. For example, in order to experience a tree, we must have the concept of a tree. So for Kant, concepts are prior to judgment in both a logical and an epistemological sense. Of course, Kant does not see concepts and judgments as completely separate. He argues that they are two sides of the same coin. Concepts are the building blocks of judgments, and judgments are the way in which we apply concepts to the world. In other words, concepts and judgments are complementary. Concepts are necessary for judgments, and judgments are necessary for the use of concepts to make sense of the world. But epistemologically, concepts are prior to judgments. However, both Bolzano and Frege seem to bypass Kant's thesis. Bolzano, when affirming that the distinction between concept and intuition hinges on a theory of propositions, and Frege, when affirming the context principle, like you discussed in the part 3.3 of your paper. How should we deal with it in the context of your paper? My second question is a terminological one, or maybe a chronological one. We are reading both Bolzano and Frege as early analytic philosophers. However, more than 75 years separate the deaths of those philosophers. We can situate Bolzano's main writings around the 1840s, and Frege's main writings around 1890s, and spanning up to 1925, the year of his death. If we call both of them early analytic philosophers, we are surely stretching the meaning of this term. How are we to chronologize analytic philosophy? I believe that we must put the origins of analytical philosophy somewhere between 1837 and 1841, when we see the publications of seminal works by Trendelenburg, the Logische Untersuchungen, Bolzano, the Wissenschaftslehre, and Mill, the System of Logic, all of which can be considered precursors or even founders of analytical philosophy. In this classification, Frege must be viewed as pertaining wholly to analytical philosophy, or as an analytical philosopher tout court. Bolzano, by contrast, can be classified as early analytical. I don't think that we we gain much clarity in the history of analytic philosophy if we just put the two in the same chronological category. And finally, my third question, my third doubt, is what can be called a structural question about your presentation. We had two magisterial expositions of both Bolzano's and Frege's view of concepts. Both of them would be very influential in the development of analytical philosophy. However, I fail to see in your paper, in your talk, the connection between them. Since Frege didn't really read or at least acknowledge Bolzano's Wissenschaftslehre, what's the aim of contrasting them? Both views seem to be largely independent of each other. So my last question would be, in your view, what's the link between those two questions that afford a joint treatment of them?
Okay.
Okay, maybe I start with the last one. So I think of Bolzano here as a kind of background against which we can see what Frege really brought new to the discussion. Yeah, so it's Bolzano is very much someone who follows Kant in a way, in his distinction between concept and intuition. And I mean, maybe a kind of common theme is that they have both theories of propositions, which you think are fundamental, and use them in many different respects. But what happens is, and then something new happens. Yeah. So, but you first need to make clear what is the kind of general background, what people would think of around whatever 1850 as a good view of a concept, or kind of standard assumptions they would make about concepts. And here, this Kantian idea is very important. And then against that background, you can see that Frege does something really new. Yeah, he's okay. As I said, I have to be careful. Maybe Frege does not really do something really new, but he just returns to the Stoics. But there is, with respect to this kind of literature, the Kantian literature and the kind of logical literature of the time, something new is happening. And in order to see this, you want to give an exposition of how things looked for people at that time, what they would take for granted. And the other thing is, I mean, I don't want to say, the other thing is that this Kantian tradition, reformulated in the way Bolzano did in the theory of propositions, just vanishes. Yeah, it's like two ships passing each other without any engagement, and that's very surprising. And I mean, you might think there is still something to be gained from the Bolzano way of doing things. So I don't want to say that one leads to the other, but it's like the one is the background in which this thing really comes to the foreground, and show which news there are and what kind of new moves are made. So that would be my answer to the last question. Bolzano, Frege, analytic philosophy. Who knows where? I mean, I don't know where the beginning of analytic philosophy is. Most people would say it's in Cambridge in 1898, when Russell followed Moore in the revolt against idealism. At least that's, so to say, the self-proclaimed beginning. But what makes me think of, as I said, Bolzano as I'm happy to say, precursor, very early analytic philosopher or something like that, is the methodology. Yeah, Frege, Bolzano, later Russell have a premium on importing mathematical methodology into general philosophical discussion. Yeah, they like definitions, they like deductive arguments, they like axiomatization. So this kind of similarity makes me think of, as I said, I'm very happy to think of Bolzano as a kind of precursor, pioneer of analytic philosophy. But there is a continuity in the approach, and in part in the theory of propositions, which they all like. Yeah, they all think that we need to use some notion of a proposition to approach important philosophical problems, which is not so much the case in the neo-Kantian literature. But yeah, I mean, everyone draws, I think, their distinctions a bit with respect to an interesting narrative they can give. Bolzano didn't directly influence Frege. Some people say, well, Frege has read Bolzano and but never fessed up to it, never was coming out with it. But the kind of similarity in approach makes me think that we should give Bolzano some kind of credit as an early analytic, very early analytic philosopher, very early philosopher who did things very similar to analytic philosophers later. So I mean, I might need to backtrack, make things more careful there. Okay, so I think I forgot already. Not forgot. I tried to get back to the first point. So in Kant, tell me again. So judgments and concepts are on the same level, interdependent. Can you?
Judgments are prior to concepts are prior to judgments, and in Bolzano and Frege, I think it's the other way around, because we have the propositions. Bolzano's theory of concepts hinges on a theory of propositions, and Frege's theory of concepts hinges on the context principle, or at least a version of the context principle.
Yeah, so I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, Bolzano, when Bolzano talks about ideas as parts of propositions, he uses proposition as the conceptual primitive. It's not defined, everything else is defined with respect to that. But this is all in the theory of propositions. We don't know anything about judgments. Kant talks about judgments, and I think it's perfectly compatible. I actually would need to look that up. I mean, Bolzano has also a theory of judgment, but I can't somehow download it now into working memory how that works. But I think there's room to think that when it comes to judgings, I mean, judgings are you latch onto a proposition. You think you grasp a proposition, but well, the proposition is the primary thing. I think it doesn't directly entail that when the judgment, the exercise of the abilities you need to have to judge, that somehow determines an order with respect to that. I think that's open, and I would need to think more about this, or I would need to get out my third volume of Bolzano and think a bit about it. With respect to Frege, I think it's different. Yeah, I mean, I think Frege thinks that, okay, what he early on called concepts, or what later then becomes modes of presentations, in some sense, they are prior to thoughts. Yeah, they are think about working through these analogies and the commentary Wundt gives on it. Yes, it can never be found in isolation. That's just how whatever chemistry is and chemistry's laws, and that's how logic is. Yeah, they all only come with their friends. They're never alone. They only come. But when it comes to the explanatory potential, the order of explanation, there are actually building blocks, and the way these building blocks are shaped and their properties, they determine which thoughts there are and which thoughts can there be. So with respect to, say, the order of extraction or the order of distinguishing, yes, thoughts are primary, but there is still room for a notion of a thought building block. A thought building block is explanatory prior to the thought. So that would be very Kantian then.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, we will now open to questions. I would first ask Professor Thomas Rubel, who is here with us, if he has any questions to Professor Textor.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Right. Thank you very much for that paper, Mark. It's a fascinating topic, and I was quite stunned to learn about that this sort of parallel drawn between the concept-object distinction and chemistry was so widespread at the time. I mean, you cited Wundt, but then you traced it back to, well, all roads lead back to Lotze. You traced it back to Lotze, but so does it? The first question is, I'm not sure. Does Frege himself sort of draw explicitly the analogy to chemistry? That then in okay, and because related to that, I tended to. That's probably only indicative of my partial education. I tended to sort of think of Frege's concept-object distinction more as arising from him being a mathematician and using the notion of a mathematical function as the model of a thought. And if you do that, of course, you also get that, the saturated, unsaturated stuff out of that. Well, that would be my first proper question, where it's sort of how, so to speak, the way of looking at the concept-object relation as, in some sense, mirroring chemical relations, how that relates to it sort of mirroring the notion of a mathematical function. And then looking forward a bit, you sort of took us wonderfully through the 19th century there, all the way to Russell's, and of course Russell and Wittgenstein, and what by all accounts sort of prompted a lot of development between them, and ultimately even the Tractatus, was the problems that Russell seemed to have had with the unity of a proposition, and the troubles with the multiple relations conception of judgment and stuff. And to that, I now have to ask a very dumb question, perhaps. If Russell, if Russell also followed Frege with that concept-object distinction, how come he got into the mess that he did get into? Because it seems that Frege didn't have the problem of the unity of the proposition, because precisely he had one bit that was already complete, and which was then the object, which was then put in the empty place of the function, and then you had a complete thought. So if you could just sort of illuminate the stumbling blocks that led to Russell there, that'd be also great. Thank you.
Okay, so I think, I mean, Russell is difficult because Russell says every couple of years, not every couple of months, something different. But in principles of mathematics, and even later, he doesn't follow Frege in saying that the distinction between concept and object is absolute. And so he thinks that something which it says, I mean, of course, something can be is a concept if we attribute it, but we can also talk about it. So Plato has wisdom. Something appears as a concept or property. When wisdom is something that Plato has, or wisdom is a property of many things, then it's an object. And so there is no deep distinction between concept and object. No deep distinction between something which is complete or incomplete. Because, I mean, it's something like one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. So Frege thinks there is a deep distinction. Therefore, we cannot talk about concepts with something like the concept horse. Russell thinks we can talk about concept with something like the concept I formed yesterday or the concept horse. Therefore, there's no deep distinction. And it never moved very much forward. On one story, Russell thinks the problem of the unity proposition is basically how we get from some stuff to one thing which is either true or false. And Russell thinks that can only happen if these things, one of them is a universal, one is a particular, and the particular instantiates the universal. That's the only way in which we get something more than a particular and a universal, if that thing has that. And then you only get true propositions. And if you have only true propositions, something is gone wrong, because there must be some false propositions. And it's kind of strange. I mean, I think that there's a kind of, already in 1912, he has come around to the idea that we need the multiple relation theory of judgment to solve that problem. But in 1918, I think he's impressed, I guess, by Wittgenstein back to something like propositions and not propositions, but there is at the same time, he's quite fond of the idea at that point of propositional functions and incomplete things and so on. So there's no, I mean, in the end, there is no clear answer. There are different strands in Russell's work, I think.
Thank you.
Okay, so you're absolutely right. I mean, mathematical function plays a big role in Frege. I mean, the full title of the concept script is concept script. Is it a conceptual notation modeled on the language of arithmetic? Something like conceptual notation, a language of pure thought modeled on the language of arithmetic. Yeah, so it's very much built into that they take that on board. But that just gives you, I mean, that sets him apart from people like Boole, who also use the language of arithmetic. But they have first plus and minus and equal is in there, but nothing else. You somehow have adds conceptual content and then something like that. And functions don't play a big role. But if you introduce functional signs, you need to have an idea of what do these what does the x do? Yeah, what does the x do? So that's really difficult. So Russell thinks the x is a real thing. Yeah, there are variables in the world. And the variable is something which you can be acquainted, for instance. And in Frege doesn't think that. Frege thinks there are really gaps. But what is a gap? What is a lücke? Yeah? And in order to somehow theorize that a bit, I think what they find helpful, or what Frege finds helpful, is what other people like Wundt said about chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a notation which is helpful to you, but which gives rise to puzzles when you try to understand what the notation expresses, what it refers to. What do these fx, what does x do? Is there something I could do away? Is there a gap and so on? And you need to think about ways to theorize incompleteness. And it looks to, I think, Frege that something like chemists had very similar problems. When you think about valences and what is a valence of something? What is, if you have this notation the chemists have, where you have these strokes and then you have positions in it. And so how does that work? That's at least a model which helps you to remove this puzzlement a bit.
Right, I see. That's interesting, because I would have, again, I mean, it's a little bit striking in as much as I would have thought, but that Frege would have thought of the realm of mathematics as more self-contained, which, as it were, doesn't, does not require further, deeper explanation of why things are
it's not
the
a
way
deep
in the realm.
explanation, I think, but it's a kind of pedagogical model.
Oh, I see.
You want to understand the kind of the most, I mean, I think he thinks really incompleteness and completeness, that's how the world is. That's really at a very fundamental level. That's an important distinction. But in order to teach people that, in order to understand it, you need a kind of useful model for it.
Oh, okay.
That doesn't say that things are all complete in the sense of whatever, atoms or molecules or something like that. But you need, that helps you to understand this.
Okay.
I think it's pedagogical.
That's good. Right. Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to know if there are any questions in the audience. Professor Frechette, I'd like you to please come here.
Okay. So hi, Mark. Thanks for your talk. It was great. I was a bit puzzled when you presented Bolzano as one of these philosophers who understand concepts, in that kind of a position between intuitions and concepts. I mean, you find I'm not saying that he's a precursor of, well, I mean, he is a precursor of Frege, but what I mean by this is that, he has these ideas that this view of concept, of course, I mean, he opposes concepts to intuitions, as many people did at that time, but he also has this view that a concept, I mean, his definition of concept is, that part of a proposition that is not itself a proposition. So, I mean, you already have this idea that, he's, I mean, concepts, you don't have concepts like this in the world. They need something else in order to be, in order to fulfill their function. So I was a bit puzzled because, I mean, Bolzano has this idea, and also, I mean, his logic of variation really points at this idea that, there's an empty space in the proposition, and this is filled, by a concept. So, I mean, if saturatedness, unsaturatedness is another paradigm in the history of concepts, and if the first paradigm that you're interested in the opposition between intuition and concepts, I think there's some kind of I mean, the line is not so. There's not like a clear cut. It seems to me. It seems that you have ideas of saturatedness, unsaturatedness that are already, for example, in Bolzano, perhaps in Nietzsche, but I think it's there. And on the other hand, I mean, you have also other theories of concepts where saturatedness and unsaturatedness plays a role. I'm thinking, of course, in a very different sense, but it's already there. For example, in Brentano, with these ideas of the distinction between syncategorematic and in categorematic expressions.
Okay, I don't know about Brentano, but the first question I've asked myself. Yeah. So I think this is your question, and you can correct me. So so Bolzano is famous for the idea that idea variation. If you vary ideas in proposition, you get at interesting properties of propositions, and you can define, for instance, inference relations and so on, and degrees of validity and analyticity and so on. That's right. Why doesn't, if you vary something in an idea, you think there's a remainder and there's something variable, and you're very close to the idea of completeness and incompleteness. Bolzano never uses that to explain concept. I think we can agree on that, but why doesn't he do it? So he sticks with the kind of Kantian distinction. So I think when you think about what is this sometimes when he talks about a form of a sentence, he writes A has B, and the B and the A are schematic letters. So he takes that to refer to a set, and it's a set of all the variants, all the things you could you get when you vary A and B, and then you can make smaller sets, whatever, A and B, which are true. So in Bolzano uses something like a method of variation, which you then would spell out, I think, because you cannot literally vary something in a proposition, as looking at a proposition and propositions which are like it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the results of that are forms, and forms are another kind of object. Maybe they're sets or collections of propositions. So the methodology is very similar, but he never gets into the idea that we really need to theorize what it is to be incomplete, what it is to be a fragment. So it's don't ask me what the psychological reason is. Yeah. But it seems to be at the time of Frege, that is something which is prepared in the literature. People are willing to entertain that. And you can also see maybe why this is so. I mean, for someone like Bolzano, he must have an idea about functional signs in algebra or something like that. Yeah. But the notion of variation is not worked in such a way that he comes up with the idea that a proposition is made of complete and incomplete parts.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so the bit about Brentano?
Tell me a bit more about, I mean, I would need to look at that in detail. And categorematic, syncategorematic, I mean, the notion of unsaturatedness I have in mind, which animates Frege, is really quite specific. You know, there is in an expression has a property, an actual property, which determines a combinatorial potential. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we cannot say very much about this property apart from saying, look, it's like a gap, it has a gap, or it's like a keyhole, a keyhole in which you only can put very specific things. if something like that is in Brentano, I'm very happy to say, wow, it's more widespread. Something like that is clearly in the Stoics. Yeah, they have such a LEP. So it's not like unheard of in the history of logic, but it seems to me also you might think that Bolzano would be someone who could go that way. He doesn't, I think. But it's
Right, but
which makes
sorry.
It's. I think you're right. It's something you start to think about. Variable and variation are not very far apart from each other.
But just a side point, I'll close with that. But I don't remember the exact place, but I think Bolzano has also this reference to chemical analysis when he's talking about conceptual analysis at some point in the Wissenschaftslehre, if I remember right. So he uses this parallel, so we don't analyze. We provide an analysis of the concept, but we don't know if it's the final analysis. It's because it's like in chemistry. Sometimes you just find these particles, but they might be dividable further, so something like this. So I think the parallel with chemistry was, I think he was aware of some similarities with chemistry.
Yeah, they all are. I mean, it's from Peirce to whatever, Peirce, Wundt, a lot of people, chemistry. It's also in the Cassirer book. Cassirer has a whole chapter on chemistry. Chemistry and logic are thought to be mutually illuminating at this time. And I think there might be something to it.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Thank you. So do you have any more questions from either the audience or from Professor Ubel or perhaps Professor Ernesto? Okay, then with this talk by Professor Mark Textor, I'd like to thank him for coming here with us another year. Also like to thank Professor Ernesto for his comments, and of course our online audience and the audience here in the auditorium. With this talk, we close the morning session of our international meeting, and we'll also have the afternoon. Okay, so I'm sorry, had a technical problem. But yeah, with that, we close the morning session of our international meeting. We'll have the afternoon sessions today here at the auditorium and the last communication session at night. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the comment and questions. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Textor.